who has been unable to be here this afternoon, they will have access to the recorded version, and that will be available approximately a week following the webinar. We encourage you after the webinar to fill out our feedback form so that we can continue to offer high quality experiences for you. Today's webinar will be an hour and a half as opposed to the usual 1 hour that we have. We know Tom has prepared a lot of material for us today. So I know that Tom's style is to stop for questions frequently, so again, I do encourage you to continue to type your comments and questions in, and Tom will stop to take those when possible. In a moment, I will disappear from the screen, and you will see Tom and be able to hear his presentation and type your questions and comments in. In addition to the chat pod, you can also use the little symbols. If you look at the top of your screen, you see a little figure with a raised hand. If you click the arrow to the right of that figure, some options come up. So for example, I've clicked the green check mark to say that I can agree with Tom. So if something Tom has said really resonates with you, and you don't feel led to make a comment, you can always use the symbol to interact that way. So Tom comes to us this afternoon and with a variety of experiences, and he's already mentioned that he has experience in different parts of Canada, and we know also that you're an internationally recognized consultant, conference speaker, and leadership coach for Christian organizations and faith-based nonprofits. You're the president of Thriving Church Consulting, and you can be found in your virtual office and the website is given on his PowerPoint here, thrivingchurch.com. Tom has also been involved in academic theological teaching and has published numerous books and articles, and I've had the privilege of reading some of those myself and do find much of value in there for my own life and ministry. Tom was born in Cleveland, Ohio, raised in many regions of the United States, and currently lives with his wife, Lynn, in Guelph, Ontario. And you have been married to Lynn for 30 years, and she also, I know, is involved in ministry. So welcome to the webinar this afternoon, Tom, and I will leave you.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me and coming together to talk about small group ministry. You know a little bit about me. There are about 15 of us who are scheduled to join in the webinar, but we found that sometimes people may not be able to come, but they will pick up the recording later on. I want to remind you that there is a printout, a handout that you can download, and I will be walking through that pretty precisely as we go. So if you have that before you, please keep it open. And I will pause periodically just to wait, let some silence go by to see what questions you might want to type in. I'll try to pick up some of the questions that Kathleen and Cheryl and others, Grant and others may have posed on text. But Josephine will also be moderating your conversation. So even though I'm concentrating and talking to share, she will catch me up and remind me of your questions so that we can keep going. So I do want to remind you, by the way, a little advertisement. I do a great deal of internet coaching and webinar work. And if you have an interest in following up on our conversation with more personal coaching covenants or webinars for your team at your church, just let me know through my website. So we'll continue and begin to talk about small group ministry. I'm going to start really from the beginning, from pretty basic stuff, and move along as quickly as I can, pausing for questions. Small group ministry is probably one of the most significant emerging ministries in the last 10 to 15 years. It really has become the primary method of Christian education, especially for older children, say junior high school age and above, grade 7 and above, youth and adults. And even youth ministries are leaving behind the large group youth ministry on Sunday night. And because of the diversity of youth, teens, and young adults, they too are moving to embrace small group ministry as a method of youth ministry. It is replacing large groups. It's replacing women's groups, men's groups as well, gender-based groups. as a primary vehicle of fellowship and personal support and spiritual growth. So this is a very significant ministry area, but many congregations of the United Church of Canada are unfamiliar with it and really just getting new to it. And I see that some of the questions are related to that. First of all, we have to understand what a small group is and why it's different from committees and other structures. A small group essentially is a group of 3 to 12 or 15, if you stretch it, people who share some enthusiasm. It could be a book, it could be an affinity, it could be whatever, but they share some kind of enthusiasm. They covenant together to meet usually on a weekly basis. It may be bi-weekly and occasionally monthly, but if you separate too much time, we lose continuity and momentum. 3 to 15 people meet with a shared enthusiasm quite regularly to get close and go deep. What I mean by that is it is designed to create a deeper sense of trust and intimacy and friendship, far deeper than many large fellowship groups. But it is also intended to take people deeper and deeper into who they are, who God is, and what they have to do about who God is with who they are. It usually results as a small group or as individuals coming from a group with an awakening of a desire to bless others, to be in social service, to be in outreach, to be helpful, to be generous, or to bless others. Which is why, just parenthetically, small group ministry has been a huge tool to build greater outreach and greater stewardship and giving within the life of a church. I've always just described the very basic kind of small group structure as a PALS group. The acronym PALS means that whatever the affinity of the group is, that group is altogether sharing prayer in some way. Could be long, could be short, could be aloud, could be silent, whatever. But there's prayer, there's action, there's some sort of activity around an affinity or enthusiasm. There's learning going on, and it may be learning about the affinity or the activity, but it is also usually learning about faith, scripture, spirituality, spiritual discipline. And again, that may be extensive, it may be small, it may be formal, it may be informal. And then finally, it's about sharing, intimate sharing of individual life struggles and spiritual victories, talking more and more about your life journey, weekly, yearly, and so on. So that's kind of basically what a PALS group is. And I always make the point that a PALS group or a small group is very different from a committee or a task group. I sometimes call them spiritual entrepreneurs. They are a self-starting group. They have real power and control over their internal group. They function by consensus. They are not directed by a pastor. They are not given an agenda top down by a board, but they have real power to decide for themselves how they're going to conduct and talk and so on within their small group. And I will say more about that a little later, but this is a huge contrast to our usual experience with committees and task groups, which are given a mandate assigned from on high and then directed to do a particular thing, and they always have to seek approval for their planning and look to an outside source to evaluate what they're doing. Small groups are very contained, self-guiding, autonomous, spiritual entrepreneurships. We can get right on the right track when we start about building small groups in a church, starting small group life, because first of all, we have to understand demographics. Some of you have already obtained environics reports from the United Church of Canada. That helps you identify the major lifestyle segments within your particular area or region. But it's helpful for you to know that there are two basic kinds of small groups preferred by different lifestyle segments. Some lifestyle segments prefer a small group that is affinity-based. Some hobby, craft, shared enthusiasm, interest, whatever. These groups, these lifestyle segments tend to be younger. They tend to have college, business, professional training rather than liberal arts training. Many of them are in dual career relationships. They tend to be socially active. Socially, fellowship, social media active, as well as socially advocating. They tend to be moderately affluent, and they tend to be lateral thinkers. They're not linear thinkers. They have a lot of imagination and go to one side and the other. And some lifestyle segments prefer affinity-based groups. The United Church of Canada it often tends to attract, in contrast to some other more conservative or you might call them fundamentalist churches, this kind of people. Now, there are also lifestyle segments that generally gravitate to curriculum-based small groups. These tend to be older people. They sometimes have little education, and they sometimes have advanced education, master's degrees, PhDs. They tend to be job-oriented. They tend to be, I call them socially limited. I don't mean inept. I just simply mean they tend to live in cubicles, or they tend to have a smaller circle of friends or limited social media. They may be very poor, they may be very affluent, and they tend to be linear thinkers. They read books, they follow grammatical structures, and so on. And it's helpful to find out as you initiate small group ministry, well, who's out there in your community? Remember, small groups are an important way to draw in newcomers and visitors to the church. So it's helpful to know what kind of small group will most attract their interest. I want to come back to the issue of a purpose of a small group. There are many misconceptions about this. I'll put all this up there that's on the slide. Small groups are about growing people up. Very important. It is not about getting a job done. It's not a task group. It's about maturing, growing, deepening people. Similarly, a small group is not just about fellowship. The point of a small group is not that people love each other. Yes, they will end up bonding and have a great affection for each other. But that's not actually the goal of a small group. The goal of a small group is to mature or to grow people, to take them deeper into themselves, into God, into the world, and so on. I hope you understand that I am joking, I am teasing when I say the following, that many of us, clergy and laity, have discovered after many years in the church that if you spend much time with churchy people, we often discover they are really boring. Because they spend so much time loving each other that they don't go out of their boxes, out of their comfort zones, and try to learn and grow and develop their lives. But that's what seekers or newcomers or visitors are most looking for. So again, small groups are really not just about loving each other. They're not about getting a job done. They're about taking people deeper. So if you ask evaluative questions about a small group as a pastor, if you're talking to a small group leader, you always want to ask, are the individual participants growing? Are healthy relationships deepening? And are participants getting closer to Christ, or if you prefer, going deeper into God? Those are three of the key questions that you want to be asking all the time. Small groups are sometimes called cell groups. And if you look at the DNA of a cell group, in a small group, you will discover that affinity is the bond. It is that shared enthusiasm, or that common interest, or that curriculum, which is the motivator. It is why people, busy people, make time to come to a small group. So many people say, Cheryl, I'm thinking of your question about starting small group, where the minister doesn't, reside there, Someone else was talking about groups that are new to a church. Um, the reason busy people make time is that the affinity is what they're enthusiastic about. AA, or recovery groups, are a form of small groups. The reason we make time to go to an AA group is because we have an urgent need, desire, enthusiasm to kick our addiction. Same thing, it's the motivator, it's the glue that bonds people together. God is the focus. This is what makes it different from just a hobby group or a craft group. But we make no secret about the fact that in a small group there will be prayer and there will be God talk. Growth is the agenda, not just love or a task. And trust is the culture. And although I will not dwell on this, small groups need an environment of high trust in order to thrive. Think about this a moment. If a church is deeply divided, or if there's deep distrust between staff and lay, or if there are factional infighting going on within the life of a church, trust is at a low ebb, and small groups will not thrive. People will not open themselves up and step out of their comfort zones to grow in a small group if they fear that they will be judged or if they will be hurt in some way. So just as a warning, one reason church small groups fail to thrive in a United Church of Canada congregation is if there is too much of a spirit of judgment or factional infighting in the church. So we want to work on creating that trust atmosphere to make small groups thrive. So I'll carry on a little bit, and then I'm going to pause. I just want to warn you, I'm going to pause for a few seconds of silence so that you can text in your questions. You might want to be thinking about that before I do that. But I'll carry on a little bit and just explain. Every small group usually has a written covenant. It could be a verbal covenant, but it's often a written covenant. And this is so that the exercise of commitment is a little bit clearer, and it allows the small group leader to hold people accountable to their participation in the group. Covenant looks something like this. Yes, I'm ready to go deeper, enjoy my affinity. We state the purpose of the group. There may be certain time limits to the group. In other words, the group will start, this month and end in another 3 months, or this week and start and end in another 6 weeks. The time limits will also be, a certain day or a certain evening or a certain time frame. That's part of the covenant. There's usually a location. Many small groups meet elsewhere than the church building because someone's living room or a restaurant or even a pub is a more congenial and in many ways higher trust atmosphere than the church basement. The covenant usually includes a sense of the membership. I may say more a bit about this, but as we look at different kinds of small groups, some affinities limit their membership. Recovery groups may do this. Other groups open their membership and anyone new can participate at any time. So there's something about that in the covenant. There may be a key expectation of the small group related to the affinity. For example, I knew a hospitality kind of a group that was the Gardening for God group in the church, and they had an expectation that they would provide flower arrangements for special services in worship during the year. And then usually the leader of the group is named. I will be saying a great deal more about leadership in the group, but we name the leader usually. Some groups prefer rotating their leaders, but there's something about leadership in the covenant. So that's a bit about covenant, and usually people sign it, again, to add their commitment to it. As small groups develop, they will customize the covenant to suit the affinity of the group. They will resist any attempt to standardize covenants or impose agendas by the institutional church, the home church. They will always try to align their small group activity with the overall mission of the congregation, but they are completely free to follow their passions. And small groups usually develop opportunistically rather than legislated. But people simply say, I am interested in this kind of a group, a support group for men or women with cancer or something like. And that's usually how the group becomes recognized, and then people will gather around that group. There are waves of development in a small group. If there are people there who are new in introducing small groups for the first time in their church, you usually do not start with an addiction recovery group. That takes a lot of built-up trust. Small groups usually begin around affinities related to hobbies, sports, music. A bell choir can become a small group. A sports team, a hockey team can become a small group. Any craft or hobby could become a small group. Reading, study, education, Bible study, book groups. Often there are then groups related to spiritual gifts, personality type discernment. Groups can begin to evolve around service projects, then health issues, personal support issues, and finally addiction recovery. But you'll see that groups tend to evolve in those waves as trust deepens and people become more confident in the small group experience. And this one last metaphor, and then I'm going to stop and I'll try to answer the questions that have been posted and see if there are other questions coming up. Think here of the difference between rabbits and dogs. Small group ministry is all about raising rabbits. You can't put a leash on a rabbit. You build a fence, but they have to have freedom to run and freedom to choose, and you have to establish boundaries of values and beliefs and trust within which they can run, but then you simply allow the rabbits to multiply. And so you start with just one or two craft or hobby related kinds of groups and design them well. As people get used to small groups, they begin to multiply opportunistically like rabbits. Remember, small groups are not committees. Committees are not like rabbits. They're like training dogs. A task group or a committee has a chain, has a mandate. It's told what to do, it's told how to do it, and often the boundaries that really constrain their activity are the boundaries of the personal tastes and perspectives and opinions and lifestyles of the most influential matriarch and patriarch. Small groups have real freedom to run. Now, I should pause here and I'm going to begin to answer two of the questions I see on my screen. Josephine may remind me of more. If others have other questions, you can throw those in right now. But let me try to answer some of the questions and then I'll carry on for a moment. Wendy asks about the difference between small groups and support groups and the place for closed and open meetings. That's a really good question. Let me elaborate a bit on what I hinted at earlier. It depends on the covenant. There are some support groups, could be a personal support group for women, for example, who are struggling against breast cancer, for men struggling against prostate cancer. Could be an addiction recovery group related to alcohol, prescription drugs, or any number of things. For many of these kinds of groups, they may well want to say that the group is a closed group. And the closure of the group may, according to the covenant, happen after the first, second, or third session of the group. For example, I once knew a church was really into small groups. Trust levels were very high, but they had a victims of incest group. And the covenant of this group is that they would meet every Friday night for 3 years in the most secure, confidential, soundproof room of the church. The leader was sent to be trained at a community college, and after the second session, no one knew would join. So that's an example, like an extreme example of a closed group. However, there are many support groups which are quite open. The key here is it's the decision of the group participants. It's a consensus decision, not imposed from outside. They have the power to make up their own mind. I hope that helps, Wendy. Next question was, how do we train facilitators to do mentoring moments for the participants? I'll say a bit more about mentoring moments shortly, but you could use a book like one of my books, which is called Christian Mentoring, available on Amazon.com. But basically, mentors are generated by mentors. This is where the pastor plays a very important role. The pastor is not going to be the leader of all the small groups, can't possibly do so. The pastor and a lay leader may help with the basic nuts and bolts training of a small group. But one of the things the pastor often does, especially, is to covenant with one-on-one time, often weekly, over a period of time. And they help a leader of a group learn how to ask open-ended questions, how to discern the spiritual growth and the level of spiritual growth and the speed of spiritual growth, you might say, in which participants are moving, so that they then can intervene to ask important questions about their next steps in their spiritual journey. Mentoring moments usually occur at closure. Every small group must have a closure time. And it depends on the covenant when that is, but there comes a time when it's over. And you may be able to re-up and sign on for another stint in the same group, but the closure means that the small group leader takes every individual participant aside privately, somehow, somewhere, and basically talks to them one-on-one about their next step to go deeper and further, their next step in spiritual growth or in personal growth, and then can guide that person to suggest that maybe you should leave this group and join a different group or go there or that. That mentoring moment is pretty crucial to the closure of a small group. I may come back to that in a few moments. So let me continue. Tips and tactics on small groups. For those of you who are following my handout, I'm kind of in the middle or down toward the end of page 2. I wanted to say, by the way, that you always identify a leader first rather than advertising a topic. And one of the things I see all the time, and I want to warn you against, is never ever put sign-up sheets on the back of the sanctuary wall with a bunch of topics or affinities on it and ask people to sign up. That's not how people join small groups. People join small groups by personal invitation. Usually a leader is trained, identified to be a small group leader, has some affinity or enthusiasm in their mind that they would like to build a group around, and then that leader will go fishing in every potluck supper and coffee hour, and they'll just go up to individual people and say, I'm starting this kind of a group, and this is what it's going to look like. Are you interested? If so, please. And it's all a personal invitation to join. So from the very get-go, small group is all about relationships. Step back a little bit. If you're the pastor or a small group developer, layperson in charge of small groups, if you could step back a little bit and overview all of the small groups you're trying to develop, you see that there is within this a strategy, I call it a discipling. That's kind of a Willow Creek or a independent Saddleback Valley church kind of a way of thinking, but it's a discipling process. The way you grow up a mature Christian disciple is that first you help them discover more about who they are, who God is, and so on, and their relationships. Then you help them discern their own personal spiritual gifts, personality types, passion, their own calling of God to be in mission and part of God's movement. And then they will bond with a team or another kind of a group to be involved in a particular mission, and they kind of place themselves in the Christian movement, and they have a sense of following Christ in a certain way. And as you step back and look at small group development, there's a certain sense in which, in the midst of all the different kinds of affinities and curriculums, there are three kind of bases or steps in small group life. There are discovery groups, in which I learn more about who I am and who God is in our relationships. There are what I call destiny groups, in which I learn more about my gifts, my calling, and how I can fulfill myself in God's mission. And then there are mission teams or missional groups, which are actually engaged in doing whatever it is God has called them to do with great enthusiasm and skill. And in a sense, as pastor overseeing a small group church, people are moving in and out of those groups all the time. For example, this is a very old Saskatchewan story, so I have no idea about that church or what's going on in it now. But I was in this church at one time 20 years ago as a national officer, and here they are doing small groups. And it starts out with a discovery group of musicians. It includes the organist, an accordion player, a jazz music, whatever. It's a group of musicians who have who love music and want to learn how to come closer to God in music, and that's just a discovery group. And they learn more about music, and they learn more about God, and they learn more about the Bible, and so on. Then there's a mentoring moment when that group reaches a closure. Now, some of them re-up for that discovery group because they're not done discovering about themselves. But a couple of them want to go further. And one says, I feel music is a vehicle for evangelism. I want to be able to use my music, play in nursing homes, play music on street corners, play music in different kinds of worship centers. I want to use music as a way of sharing and inviting people into faith. That becomes a destiny group. They begin to focus what that might be, as they talk about that. And they learn more about their gifts and their calling. Then another mentoring moment, and some of those people move on. Some of those musicians, for example, went on to be musicians in a circuit of nursing homes where they would regularly perform and bring music and share faith to the people within the home. Now, along the way, then, they began to witness things that disturbed them and troubled them. And so in a mentoring moment, they actually rotated out of that nursing home ministry group back into a discovery group, a group where they can find the answers to the questions about God and death and suffering that had begun to be raised in their mission. So you see, life is this journey, I've just gotten a sign that says there's a warning of some kind. Can everybody still hear me? I hope so. Someone's going to tell me if you can't. So life is this journey, this process among the small groups as you step away and look for it. There are the bases, and then there are the mentoring moments. As you go along, there are two flows in this relationship process. There's two flows in discipling. After I run through this, I'm going to pause a moment to see if there are any questions that are coming up. And if not, I'll continue. Basically, small group leaders guide groups through a flow of relationship building and faith building. This can be trained for small group leaders, and basically you're leading people through relationship building that moves from conversation to shared information to sharing ideas, then feelings, then dreams, a sense of team activity, And then there's the mentoring moment, closure, and the multiplication of groups. And basically, the small group leader is trained to help people move beyond a period where they get bored, beyond any sense of competition with each other, beyond any disagreements, personality conflicts, and so on, to a place of enough spiritual maturity that when they leave the group, they will grieve for the group in a healthy way, and then they can move on in their spiritual growth. In the same way, the group leader is building faith, taking them beyond that simple covenant that we created as a small group, and beyond just curiosity about the Bible or God, and even beyond a better awareness of Scripture, to build a deeper trust, to ask the really deep faith questions that are burdening their hearts, eventually again into some sort of activity which blesses other people. And I call it holy discontent. There's always a sense in a small group that they've peaked, and that in order to continue in building their faith, they actually leave that partnership and move on to a new or a different kind of group. If they do not, then they will begin to doubt themselves and to fall backwards in terms of their faith development. I could say a lot more about some of that, but most small group guides, and there's a great deal of literature out there, will have a whole lot of tips and tactics about how you train a small group leader in the relationship building and the faith building flow. I want to spend time on leadership for the small group, and I pause though for a moment to see if there are any key questions. I'll silently hum the Jeopardy theme song, let a few seconds go by, and if there are no questions, I'll carry on. I'm waiting. I see somebody's typing. Well, I guess we're all set then. I'll carry on. Everyone can hear me. What Wendy was typing was, does one participant's question sometimes lead the whole group into doubt? Wendy, the answer is kind of yes and no. The small group leader will begin to kind of gauge, all of that. It's okay if somebody's question leads everyone to begin to rethink and question their own faith positions. All of that is okay. And in terms of the small group faith development process. But it is important, I think, that the small group leader helps to remind the group itself that their dialogue partner in this is the basic foundation of trust, core values, and bedrock beliefs of the church of which the small group is a part. It's not that they simply have to accept something. It is a dialogue. It is that's the stone against which the sharpened knife of their minds is being honed. So participants are encouraged to express their deepest doubts. The small group leader does not have to be the expert who provides the instant answer, but encourages the group and the individual to explore those answers. Sometimes the group leader will offer various resources, books to read, scriptures to look up, to answer the question for themselves. And there are occasions when doubts or questions, faith questions within a small group, will prompt the leader to bring the pastor as a visitor into the group to also begin to deal with some of those questions. Since we are kind of, I think, touching a bit on the role of the leader, I'm going to go there in a moment. I'll wait for Wendy, who's typing again. Conscious that my time march is on, but we're doing pretty well, I think. I'm wondering particularly about this holy discontent where the participant begins to transcend the group. Again, thank you, Wendy. It's a great prompting question. Perhaps you have all noticed in any kind of a group you've been in, whether it's women's group, men's group, youth group, even task group, committee group, whatever group it is, you may have had that sense that that the growth curve has flattened out, that people have questions or issues or concerns, but they are not really being understood or addressed within the life of that particular group that they're in. And it becomes clear that that group as it is will probably never really be able to address, answer, or deal with that kind of question. It may be a question that is of importance to an individual, but the others in the group, it's just simply not their issue. It's not their question. But for whatever reason, we often see in a group, often there's a blankness that comes across the eyes or the face or something, but we can sense in the group that someone is stopped, plateaued, and discontented. And that, I believe, is the activity of the Holy Spirit in a group. It is a sign of growing maturity for that individual. And unless the small group leader is able to intervene, that often happens in a mentoring moment, to intervene and say, you can move and find an answer to this question or deal with your spiritual growth concerns in a different setting with a different group. Unless that happens, that individual often will drop out of the existing group and then just even drop out even of the church or drop out of the spiritual growth process in general. And that, of course, you don't want to happen. So that's what I mean by holy discontent. It's that moment when an individual realizes, I've learned about as much as I'm going to learn in this music group or in this Gardening for God group or in this AA group. I've gone about as far as I can. That's what I mean by holy discontent. I'll carry on. I'm on middle page 3 for those of you who have the handout, and I want to spend some time about leadership, because leadership is the number one concern in small group development, not affinity. The affinity, the topic, the book, the curriculum, and that can be anything. And I've known groups that start out with one affinity and blend into another, or start out with one book and go to a different one. The real issue in terms of the health, success, longevity, and multiplication of small group is the leader. Now, there's a very fundamental demographic issue at stake at the very beginning. Some lifestyle segments prefer a designated leader, an appointed, declared leader who in a way has literally been blessed from the pastor, and often these leaders are brought up in worship. They kneel before the communion rail and their hands are laid upon them and people pray for them. That's a designated leader. They are handpicked by the pastor often. They are very well trained and coached constantly. They combine the roles of being a host or hostess, coordinator, and leader of discussion. And they have a very important role in holding participants in the group accountable to the boundaries of trust, the core values of the church, the bedrock beliefs, the goal for relational and personal growth. So this is a much more assertive leadership role. And some lifestyle segments prefer designated leaders. Now, other lifestyle segments prefer rotating their leaders. They actually don't want someone appointed. They are in a group and they all want to take turns. This week it's your turn. And that group the group itself may be oriented by the staff in how to facilitate and host a group. But basically the rotation is expected of every member of the group. So therefore accountability in the group is lower, which means that the pastor will probably be on hand if needed to do some sort of personality conflict intervention or other kind of boundary crossing intervention if it's necessary. You can guess, I'm sure, hearing me, that it is harder to monitor and to encourage strong accountability using rotated leadership. But there are preferences in lifestyle segments. Lifestyle segments that often prefer rotating their leaders are people who have great skepticism about authority figures or about institutions in general. But there are also often people that have great self-confidence. Maybe they are business leaders or successful leaders, teachers in their own right, and they feel that they already have skills for facilitating conversations and organizing a meeting and so on. So the combination of skepticism about authority and confidence in their own ability, these lifestyle segments may prefer rotated leaders. Many lifestyle segments, however, welcome a designated leader. They may not feel confident to be a leader of a group and will not want to take it or turn. And they may feel very vulnerable if issues of accountability and trust is a worry for them. They want the rotated leader because it's a way of preserving, well, their safety, you might say, their integrity within the life of a group. So different lifestyle segments have different approaches. And you may find in your church and in your mission field that you have all those lifestyle segments, and so you'll have both a rotated leadership plan and a designated leadership plan. Now, if you're looking for leaders, if you're going on a designated leader plan, how do you find these leaders? One way in some churches that are heavily invested in spiritual gift discernment is that they use spiritual gifts inventories to discover who is gifted in hospitality or who's gifted in faith sharing or who's gifted in management or so on. But for many churches, small churches and many united churches that are not heavily invested in gifts discernment, the path is really fairly simple. Number one, you, the pastor, you take the membership list or you look out at your congregation and you survey them with new eyes, looking for a certain kind of person, which I'll describe in a second. Sometimes you describe this person publicly and ask for recommendations, and people will give you names. And then sometimes you will use some spiritual gifts discernment kind of strategy. But this is the kind of person, when you look at the congregation or the membership with new eyes, fresh eyes, remember now, you're not looking for a board member. You're not looking for a committee leader or a task group leader. You're looking for someone with a particular kind of integrity. You're looking for someone who is practicing a deeper, daily, regular spiritual discipline. Someone who is a spiritual person. They may read the Bible daily or pray regularly. They certainly attend worship regularly. You're looking for someone who can keep secrets, someone who is trusted, someone to whom members of the church often go to share their life struggles and issues, knowing that they can maintain confidentiality. You certainly want to make sure you're looking for someone who is utterly faithful in their covenant relationships, in their marriage covenants. You do not want flirtatious people. You do not want dangerously playful people. You want people, as you look, who are committed to equality. People who are genuine about respecting men, women, people of different race, people of different culture, to the best of their ability, equally. Who does not display a great sense of bigotry or bias. You want someone who is humble, someone who is willing to accept criticism, someone who can listen, someone who can be taught, who is teachable, someone who doesn't have an inflated ego. You're looking for someone who's a self-starter, an entrepreneur, doesn't need to be told, will do it themselves. You're looking for a person with a certain style. You're looking for someone who tends to be patient with others, who tends to have a broader vision of God's mission, who behaves gently and non-confrontationally with people, and yet someone who has the courage to call a spade, and share and speak honestly with others. You're looking for someone who's a people person, not a task person, someone whose first thought is concern for individuals and their feelings in their life, not to get a job done. And you're looking for someone who behaves inclusively. I've known pastors in small churches to literally, with a PowerPoint or even an overhead projector, they'll put this on the wall, and they'll say, "I'm looking for this kind of person," and then they'll pass a piece of paper out to everyone in the pews, and they'll say, "Please write down the name of two people that came to mind. They may not be perfectly matched to this description, but they came to mind as I was describing this person. Write down their names. Make sure it's not your name." Hand them in. Pastor reads them over afterwards. Certain names come out. Certain names get repeated. That's your short list. Now you take each one of them to coffee, to lunch, and you ask them these 4 questions, usually after you paid the bill and they're eating dessert. Do you share the vision? What I mean to say is, do you share the vision of spiritual growth? Do you share the vision of getting deeper and deeper with Christ and deeper in relationships to others? Do you get excited about that? And then the second question is, you seem to have gifts that help you keep confidences and build relationships and so on. And the question really is, do you use those gifts or hide them under a bushel basket? Do people at work, at home, at play, do people look to you for that kind of relational and spiritual benevolence? Third question, are you personally ready to grow? Are you teachable? Are you willing to do training? Are you willing to be coached? Do you want to grow yourself spiritually and relationally? Then the fourth question is, do you feel God's calling you to do this ministry at this time? You may have to let go of some other committee responsibilities. You might have to give up some other things. But if you have the vision, if you use the gifts, if you yourself are ready to grow, and if you feel called, then now you're invited into training. I'll skip over that for the moment to the leadership training. You want to spend time training your leaders before you really launch into ministry, small group ministry. Now that can be very sophisticated and complicated, but it can also be very simple. Basic training is often just a day retreat, or it might be spread out over several evenings. But basic training, and I'll share a bit with you about what happens in basic training. But basic training just helps people get the basics, the foundation of how to lead a small group. Then quarterly, biannually, there's usually another retreat or maybe an evening where you'll review progress, you will coach, you will add special training and expertise. And then the third layer of training is that the pastor or a lay leader will always be available 24/7 for any emergencies or coaching. That's what training looks like. This is the content of the training. Basic training that day apart. I usually spent time training small group leaders. Maybe I only had 3, 4, or 5 of them in the room. I want them to be able to talk about their faith, about their connection with Christ. I want them to be able to articulate and describe their daily and weekly spiritual habits, and I teach them how to do that. I certainly explain the core values and bedrock beliefs of our church, which are the boundaries of trust. We go over those that relationship flow, that faith-building flow that I showed you earlier. And then the nuts and bolts, I would train a leader how to focus the goal or affinity of a group, how to shape a group covenant, and basically how to do the nuts and bolts of hospitality when a group gathers. That's kind of what basic training looks like. Usually, what happens is that you have a leader and they're trained, and then they come to you and say, I'm ready to go and I'm prepared, but I don't have a group. And I would ask them, if you had the gift of spare time, what would you do with it? Freely, without guilt, if you had the gift of time, what would be the enthusiasm, the affinity, the activity that you would most like to do? Now, maybe they say to me, I'd like to go fly fishing. And I'd say, all right, there's your group. And now you'll go to the potluck suppers and fellowship dinners and coffee hours of church, but you can even go to your office at work, at coffee break, or to your neighbors and your friends. You can go anywhere you want, and you just invite people and say, I'm gathering a small group of fly fishing enthusiasts, and you warn people in advance. It's a God group. It's not just a club, so there will be a prayer, and we will talk about God, and we will try to get to know each other well, and we'll have a great time fly fishing. Would you like to be in the group? And some will say no, and gradually a few will say yes. And when you've got 3 people, you've got a group. Then you form a covenant and you decide which river you're going to fish in on which weekends and whatever. And when it's going to start, in early April and end by the end of September, and you start your group. That's kind of basic training, and they'll go off and do their group. But as they do their group, there will be issues that arise. And that's where you have the regular upgrades, I would call them. And my small group leaders would come back, maybe quarterly, 2 times a year. We would meet and we would review what it means to create a disciple. We would talk about their plateaus. Are they stuck anywhere on the relationship and faith-building development plan? They may need extra skills in personality conflict resolution or something like that. We may bring in someone to do some extra training with them. They may bring along an apprentice that they're trying to mentor to also be a small group leader. And of course, at that time, we often spent a lot of time talking about how do you discern the level of spiritual growth? How do you take people to the next step in spiritual growth? That's called mentoring. And that's why I developed my book on Christian mentoring, which is available from Amazon.com. We'll also talk about coordinating time and so on with the covenant groups at the upgrades. And often there are communications issues that we can resolve in the groups. Some groups will be closing. We'll talk about how to do closure. The ongoing coaching, whenever that's all. You're always available 24/7. Usually the questions about ongoing coaching have to do with one of these things. Sometimes a group seems to be straying from the church, the faith of the church, the values of the church, or the purpose of the church. And that's a mission alignment issue. And sometimes the leader needs to be coached so that their small group doesn't kind of walk away from the life of the church. Sometimes the coaching has to do with worship. Most small groups are encouraged to very intentionally attend worship on a regular basis. In fact, for many, you will see that actually groups worship together as a group. Even if they leave their families, they will worship together as a group. But if they do not worship, there may be some coaching about how to develop an attitude of worship or a commitment to worship. And in a different seminar, I've talked about different kinds of worship formats. This is one reason why churches sometimes develop a different kind of worship option because of their small group ministry. Personal mentoring, I've talked about that several times. Ongoing coaching is often about mentoring the small group leader, not just in how to help their people grow, but very often the small group leader himself or herself has now found issues, questions, challenges in their own spiritual life and relational life. And that's where the counseling, coaching, mentoring will come in ongoing during the year. And of course, the continuing training and mentoring. There may be some problem solving that's going on. You know, someone will call you up and say, I've got two people that seem to argue all the time. What do I do about that? And occasionally there may be an intervention. I knew of a small group where it came to light that one of the men in the small group was dating three of the women in the same small group at the same time. That's sexual harassment. There's an intervention there, and we kind of have to break in around that trust boundary issue. So that's kind of what ongoing coaching may involve along the way. I see a couple of questions come up, and I'm going to pause and deal with them right now before I carry on. Cheryl has asked, can you speak about self-esteem, as my challenges are helping people to see their abilities? An interesting question. Number one, Cheryl, that may raise for you a need to further explore the lifestyle segments in your mission field. There are lifestyle segments psychographically that have greater or lower esteem issues. And that may lead you to address some of those challenges, to talk with nonprofit, social service, healthcare people within your community, because that may be an endemic issue that's something that's a part of the lifestyle segments you're ministering with. Beyond that, however, in your congregation, the primary reasons I found that small group leaders, I'm speaking about leadership right at the moment. I hope that's what you meant. But small group leaders may feel low self-esteem is because they're badly trained. They do not have ongoing coaching support, or they are not clear or not clearly aware of their own spiritual gifts. And so all those three things can be addressed in training, coaching, guidance. And then lastly, one of the key things is that they're not spiritually disciplined people. Low self-esteem brought on by their own inability to be really engaged in a daily, weekly spiritual discipline, which raises their self-esteem. So I'll leave it at that for the moment, and you may want to follow up. But I do agree with you, Cheryl, that I've been in many United churches which have tended to attract, this isn't the best way to say it, but they tend to attract needy people who have low self-esteem. They certainly don't want to be a small group leader. And one of the big challenges in a small group is from the very, very beginning, it's a discovery issue. They need to be helped to discover their inner worth, their spiritual gifts, their place in God's plan. That kind of thing is often very important. But in a church which has attracted a lot of, if you'll excuse the phrase, needy people, then you may struggle to find a small group leader with sufficient self-esteem to be a leader. You may be able to rotate the leadership. You yourself, as pastor, may need to become the leader and apprentice someone along the way. You might look within the church for a leader, but you can look outside the church for a leader too. Another church's member, another person from the community. So long as that outside person is compatible with your core values and beliefs as a church, then even if they're not a member, they could become a small group leader. Wendy asks, have you found that people choose their small group instead of worship, that it meets their needs so they do not choose to be a part of a larger group of a congregation? Yes. I see that a fair bit, Wendy. There are two things that I would say. Well, the first things that should say to you and to the church is that there's a serious problem with worship. And that's another conversation. If worship is that boring, to be honest, or irrelevant, or maybe I'll put it this way, if worship is so, here's keyword, disconnected from motivating and coaching personal spiritual life, something's wrong with worship. That has led many pastors to redesign their worship services, to become more what I call coaching worship services, or to become more interconnected, to pray for, encourage, and train spiritual life and individual spiritual connections. So, worship that is profoundly expository, abstract, rational, and to be honest, worship that's often very liturgical, standardized, uniform, often disconnects with people who are in a small group life. Now, the second point, on the other hand, worship may be fine, but this becomes a training issue with the small group leader. It all comes back to leadership. If people in a small group or the whole small group does not feel it important to connect with worship on a regular basis, the primary reason is usually that the leader of that group doesn't think it important either. So that's the time to take the leader aside and say, what's going on? And is worship that unimportant to you that you cannot model for your own group participants why it's important? Now, you don't twist arms. You can't, force people to go to worship. But the small group leader can do many things to encourage worship attendance, their own faith sharing, their own sharing of the importance of worship in their own spiritual lives, the invitation to sit together and to be with them, to sit and gather as a small group, even the invitation to go and have coffee themselves after the worship service is over and enhance the fellowship of the group. There may be a lot of tips and tactics that they can do. Most small groups end, the last thing that's said often in the small group after a session is the small group leader saying to the participants, I'll see you next Sunday in worship. That constant reminder. All right. I'll carry on. I'm now on page 4, the big section called the Church of Small Groups. And I see I have about 20 minutes or so before I need to finish. So I'm doing pretty well on time. This may or may not be immediately relevant to some of you in the webinar today, but I think it is to some. Some of you are really just getting into small groups, but there are others who are into small groups and it's beginning to catch hold. Groups are beginning to multiply like rabbits. There are more of them. And I was recently consulting with some United Churches here in Ontario, declining churches that actually had lifestyle segments within them that were captivated by the idea of becoming a church entirely composed and entirely about small group life. And so we're talking about the evolution of a church with small groups to become a church of small groups. There are books out there about this which I could refer you to or something if you email me. There's a literature around this, and there are a growing number of churches. Some of them are mega churches, some of them are micro churches, some of them are multi-site churches. Size isn't the big issue. That have a whole strategy of being a church of small groups. Essentially, they have a core worship experience surrounded by multiplying rabbits of small groups, starting and stopping all over the place. And that's it. There's no other structure. There's no other programming, so to speak. Often they don't even have a Sunday school. They don't have a lot of committees. They are simply that, a church of small groups. And this is a growing phenomenon. So I wanted to say a little word about the fullness of the small group ministry as it transforms a church to become a church of small groups. There is a structure a staffing strategy, a leadership development strategy now, which is much more elaborate. The ratio 1:3:5:2. This is a church that, in addition to the pastor, has a position. It's often a full-time position. If it's part-time, it's often a paid position. Occasionally, it's a volunteer position. This church may not have an organist. They may not have a Christian educator. They may not have a visitor. The most important second staff person is the small group developer. That developer gathers a team of 3 leaders. Sometimes they're called ministers, pastors, shepherds, whatever. And they in turn will begin to train clusters or groups of leaders, usually around different kinds of affinities. So there'll be a recovery small group ministry over here, and then there'll be a music small group of, gathering a cluster of small groups over here, and then maybe one around some sports or crafts or hobbies, or that's the kind of clustering that is done. So the small group developer has overall oversight over this training and multiplication of groups. They have 3 kind of team ministers that work with her or him, and they have different area group leaders, and then of course they have all kinds of small group leaders they're raising up for the various starting and stopping groups, and they often have small group apprentices in their midst. So the structure is not carved in stone, but you get the idea how small group has now been the sole purpose, you might say, of this congregation. Small group developer in a small church may be unpaid, but one thing you do know is this leader is never hired by a committee. It is chosen and handpicked by the pastor. They take overall responsibility. They make sure all the groups are aligned to the mission of the church. They're strongly involved in the process to identify, select, and train and coach small group leaders. They often oversee a very intense spiritual gifts discernment process for all members and visitors and community people around the church. And this small group developer basically kind of administrates what is the one and only program, which is the multiplication of small groups. The team ministers are often volunteers chosen by the developer. They are more tactical. They identify specific small group areas. They do a lot of problem solving and coaching, coordination work. They're very intentional about finding apprentices that they can raise up in the context of a group to become future group leaders. I probably should have mentioned that the small group developer, the paid or unpaid colleague of the pastor, is often gifted spiritually in discernment and administration. These team ministers that work with that developer are often gifted in leadership and teaching. And then the next layer of people are often gifted in teaching and shepherding, exhortation, knowledge, and mercy. These are all spiritual gifts inventory kind of language. The various small group leaders then are chosen by the team ministers using the integrity and style criteria I named earlier. And many of these group leaders now become, in a church of small groups, these small group leaders now become the effective pastors of the church. They are often brought forward and anointed in worship and called pastors, shepherds sometimes. Because the small group now becomes the primary caregiving unit of the church. The pastor is not the caregiver. The staff person is not the caregiver. All the caregiving, if someone's seriously ill, it is the small group leader who will arrange chicken soup or visitation, see them in the hospital or whatever. It can be carried to such lengths that if there's a death in the family of someone in the church, it is their small group leader, not the pastor, who will actually do the funeral. Even in provinces or states where lay non-ordained people can marry, if there's a wedding to be done, it may be the small group leader. That group leader now is the effective caregiver within the life of a group. And you begin to see the intimacy that can generate in the life of a church. So the apprentices are usually new small group leaders, emerge from the spiritual growth of the small group, mentored, on-the-job training. These two are gifted as small group leaders. And so the new people for small group leadership are literally being homegrown or homeschooled in the life of a small group. They emerge from the small group, and the groups continue to multiply. Now, I won't say much about this, but this does mean a great change in the whole organization and structure of a church, which is very foreign to many established traditional churches, including most United Church of Canada congregations. It is the shift, I would say, of a board now from a management to a visionary function, because so much of the actual life and work of the church has been delegated and decentralized to the small groups and the small group leaders. So most of our churches, most traditional churches, are designed to be centralized and top down, and they manage a line budget and oversee tasks, and top down they hire and fire personnel. But in a church of small groups, the old organizational model won't work. And so you have a board which models spiritual life and protects the trust of the church with a vision cast by the pastor. But the whole board is really not there to manage things. They're there to be true elders of the church and model spiritual life and protect trust. And they're going to delegate management responsibilities, because each of the small groups will have real power and authority to discern, design, implement, and evaluate mission as it is called forth from the spiritual growth and spiritual life of the church. This is what people are saying when you talk to folks out there. It's the difference between the top-down church and the bottom-up church. The bottom-up church is a church very foreign to many denominations, but the bottom-up church is one that gives real power to a small group to discern mission opportunities, implement mission opportunities, design mission opportunities, evaluate results, without ever once having to get the permission of a board or report to an institution. And many times in a true church of small groups, the pastor doesn't even know what's going on in mission until it's already happened and the small group leader told them about it, and then they thank God for it. It's a very different kind of church, but this is the kind of church that often is at the far end of small group ministry. Small group ministry literally taking over and revolutionizing the church itself. I've just kind of given you a couple slides that comment on that. There's the different kind of church. Traditional churches provide basic hospitality. The coffee hour involves a lot of friendly chatter. Worship tends to be very educational and caregiving. Things run because of committee meetings and large groups. But a church of small groups goes way beyond basic to multiple choice hospitality. If you listen to the conversations over coffee, they are very deep and very significant. Worship is often less formal, coaching worship, or very pumped up inspirational worship. There are no committees, just teams and small groups. So last slide really about that. A church of small groups is a very simple church. There's very engaging worship that motivates people into small groups. In any given worship congregation, at least 60 to 75% of the participants show up midweek in a small group. There's very opulent and radical and sensitive hospitality within the small group life. I'll pause there a moment. I don't want to show you that slide. It's too much of a sidetrack. Okay. In a moment, I want to talk about transitions for the last moments of our webinar. I see a couple of questions. From St. Paul's. What can a mainline church reasonably expect around buy-in with small group participation? That's a great question. I think it will vary a great deal from church to church, but many your best buy-in, let me come at it this way, your best buy-in in your church for small group participation will be among those who are younger or who are relatively new within the last 2 or 3 years to the church. Not just transferring from another church, but they're either younger folks or they're relatively new to the church itself. They've really not been involved in a church before. Those people are most likely to quickly respond well to small groups. The people who are going to be reluctant will be older people, often, and they will be people who are veterans and have a long time have been connected or a part of an institutional church. It's not that they're bad people or anything, it's just that folks that have been brought up a long time connected with the institutional church, which is all about task groups and committees and so on, just have a hard time getting the concept of what the heck a small group is and why it's different. They don't see that rabbits are different from dogs, if I use my metaphor. Now give them time and they will buy in. So very often you start slow and then you pick up speed exponentially, because some of these people that don't get it, they will wake up and see it, kind of an aha moment, and then you will see it begin to take off. So I guess my best advice is be patient. Start with the waves of groups, mainly around affinities for hobby, sports, crafts, books, etc. Be patient, generate a few small groups, and aim toward younger or newer members of the church to get the ball rolling. Wendy asks, why unpaid staff? I'm not sure for sure how you mean that question, Wendy, but I'll talk around it a bit. First of all, we recognize today that there is such a thing as unpaid staff. We tend to think of staff, paid, same thing. But more and more, between budget cuts and retirees and talented volunteers, what we see in churches is that small group developers have the skills, the abilities, the time, and they are treated and held accountable just like staff, but they're simply not paid. Or if they're paid, they turn it back to the church or something like that. That's what we mean by unpaid staff. And the reason small group developers are often unpaid, at least to start with, is often simply a budgetary restriction. So that's what I mean by unpaid staff. I hope that answered the question. Now, I just have a few minutes more, and if I may, let me look at the last page of transitioning to small group ministry. I'm hoping that a number of these things are going to be instantly clear as we go through this because of our webinar together. It may take you 3 to 5 years for a traditional church to transition to a church of small groups. And of course, that indicates it could take you even 2 or 3 years just to get into, really chug into small group ministry itself. But it could easily take 3 to 5 years to really transition that church. And here are some of the keys. To begin with, bottom line, before you can even really get very far into small group ministry, you've got to do things we've been telling you to do, really, people have been telling you to do in transforming churches for decades. You've got to have a big, bold, clear vision and mission. And there's a lot of literature out about that. I do a lot of coaching about that myself. But you have to have some clarity about your purpose as a church. And you have to then, secondly, build a foundation of trust, which is clarity and consensus around predictable behavior patterns in your church and the bedrock core convictions, faith convictions of your church. Now, having done that, now you begin to just look at your church and understand what you've got to build on. Number one, you already may have small groups in your church that you don't even know about or have really recognized as small groups. You can build with those. You may already have larger groups that already have begun to function as small groups. Assess how intentional your spiritual growth is in the church. I noticed Cheryl commented that it sounded like the church needed to go back to the foundation where it focuses on spiritual practices. And that's true. A church with no sense of spiritual practice has a hard time developing small groups. And you also have to look at how severe your burnout is. Sometimes before you can get into small groups, you have to terminate a lot more committees. You can't make time unless you take away some time. Well, after you've kind of assessed, where your church is at, you need to make a decision as to what you want to be. This really is a board decision. Do we really want to go this path? And then you want to start out by getting the first groups right. Those of you that do ceramic tiling, if you've ever done that home renovation, you know the key to ceramic tiling is you've got to set the first tile exactly right. Because all the other small groups are going to be keyed on that one group that you get right. And it may take you 3 or 4 or 5 attempts to get a group going, follow it through to fruition, and close it in a healthy way before you get it right. But then once you get it right, you key on that small group. You say, see, this is how it works. This is what it looks like. You always recruit people into your first groups. I mentioned earlier that it's going to be from your younger or newer people. Another way of saying that is it's often you recruit them, your best small group participants and small group leaders are going to come from roughly the 2.5% of the people who are innovators in your church, early adopters. Are about often 13.5% of the people in your church. They're the ones who are most likely to join a small group. And so you work with those innovators and early adopters. You give them the basic training. You help them become a small group. And eventually you begin to draw more and more people in, kind of the middle ground people, the people that were maybe I might. And don't worry about the roughly 1/3 of the church that are all naysayers and saying we don't like it, it'll never work, and it's against United Church policy or something, because none of that's true, and in a sense you just ignore them. But you do have to protect your small group leaders from the bullies in the church who are going to try to lower their self-esteem or denigrate them or criticize them publicly. You, pastor board, will need to stand up to those people and sort of confront that bullying attitude to these innovators and early adopters. Well, I've only got about 2 or 3 minutes left, so and I know you can sort of read up on this. As you transition, you'll discover that there are certain groups, organizations that just need to be allowed to die and will never change into a small group. You'll work harder at finding the leaders and training them. Usually once you get 3 groups really going and moving and successful, other groups begin to multiply after them. Down the road, you'll probably need to do some retraining and redeploying of staff, board members, and you'll need to think about that synergy of discovery, destiny, mission, and kind of getting that system going. There's no one way and one rule to all of that, but you just keep on going and be purposeful and intentional, and your groups can begin to multiply. Lastly, here are some keys to the success of small groups. Boards and pastors must understand this to be a primary ministry, not a secondary one. You've got to let go of things, decentralize and surrender control. You have to build and embed trust. You have to begin to use your coffee hours and fellowship times as fishing pools where your small group leaders can begin to invite people into groups. You have to do training to make sure that mission and integrity and skills and teamwork happen. You have to look for the mentoring moments with your leaders, take them deeper and further. You have to confront controllers and break control when anyone's trying to dictate what groups do. Begin to invite friends, neighbors, associates, family, and any seeker you can find. Always try to provide good child care. And one of the biggest things of all is the regular upgrades and the ongoing coaching. Always practice rigorous accountability to the values, the beliefs, the vision, and the mission of the church. I'll simply finish then and thank you for being a part of this a seminar. It is recorded and is available to you. Oops, I'm going to skip over that because I wanted to get to that. I just wanted to advertise and say again, if anyone has questions or if anyone would like to talk further with their board or their team and you'd like me to do a webinar or participate with you in some way, that's what I do. And I'd be glad to meet long distance or face-to-face with folks at your church and do some more detailed coaching about how you can develop small group ministry or even a church of small groups. That's everything, Josephine. I'm a minute past my time. I'd better stop. Thanks to The Edge for sponsoring us. And thanks to all of you for participating. And God bless.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm just going to check if you can hear me.
I can.
Sometimes there's a glitch there. Thank you, Tom, for joining us and for sharing with us on your ministry of small groups. I know you've been an encouragement and resource for many people here today. And we thank you to all of the participants for being part of this experience and encourage you to follow up with Tom's Thriving Church Consulting. And we also hope to see you again during another webinar. Next week we have Brian McLaren with us, and he will be talking on his book Naked Spirituality, and that will be Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. Finally, as Tom mentioned, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available in about a week. And we encourage you to fill out the feedback form. And I actually have some polls that I'm going to put up here on the screen. It's a new thing that we're trying to make it easier for you to do. So as soon as we sign off, you'll see 3 quick questions. If you could fill those out, that would be great. Again, thanks very much and have a good rest of the day, everyone.